What would you do if the only thing your father left you was a fool's errand? A madman's map to a ghost story. A final whispered plea to dig for something the world had long ago decided was lost forever. For 19-year-old Cora Lynette Hayes, that inheritance was a patch of cracked earth in the middle of a dry lakebed, a place the townsfolk of Alkali Flats called the Devil's Griddle. The story was of a stagecoach, swallowed by a flash flood 100 years before, carrying a fortune that had become nothing more than a child's tale. But her father's belief had been the one solid thing in a life of shifting dust, and his final request was a debt she intended to pay, no matter the cost to her reputation. The world saw a grieving girl chasing a phantom, but the truth waiting under a century of sun-baked mud was heavier than gold and more binding than iron. Settle in, and let us know where you're watching from, as we follow the lonely scrape of a shovel that rewrote the history of a forgotten town. Cora Lynette Hayes stepped down from the wagon, the dust settling on boots already worn thin by a long journey home. Alkali Flats hadn't changed. It was still a handful of sun-bleached buildings clinging to the edge of nowhere, a place where the horizon was a constant, shimmering promise of more of the same. The air was thin and carried the scent of sage and silence. She had been gone 2 years, nursing her father through the sickness that had finally taken him in a town with a doctor and green trees, a place he'd hated with a quiet, stubborn fury. His last breath had smelled of pine, not dust, and it had felt like a betrayal. He had made her promise to come back, not just to the town, but to his obsession. She carried it now, a worn, leather-bound journal tucked in her satchel. Its pages were filled with his spidery script, weather charts, local legends, and a hand-drawn map of the vast, dry lakebed west of town. A red X marked a spot that existed only in his mind. Her father, Samuel Hayes, had been the town eccentric, a man who spoke more to the sky than to his neighbors. He'd spent the last 20 years of his life piecing together the story of the Overland Express stagecoach, lost in the Great Flood of '78. Not 1878, but 1778, according to his research. A special commission, he'd claimed, carrying territorial deeds and mining assays from the old Spanish governor. The town laughed. The floods of their time were fierce enough. A flood from a century before was ancient history, less real than scripture. They called him the ghost digger. The name hadn't bothered him. "History ain't a ghost, Cora," he used to say, his finger tracing the lines on his map. "It's just sleeping. You just got to know where to place the shovel to wake it up." Now the shovel was in her hands. She walked through the town's only street, her gaze straight ahead, feeling the weight of windows. The whispers followed her like her own shadow. "There's Samuel's girl. Come back to dig for his treasure." Poor thing's got his madness in her. She ignored them. Grief was a hard, smooth stone in her gut, and it left no room for shame. Her purpose was simple, direct. She wasn't here for treasure. She was here to bury her father's spirit in the one place he'd ever felt it was alive. The last page of his journal had only 7 words, written in a shaking hand. "The earth remembers what the water takes." It was a strange epitaph, and a stranger inheritance. But it was all she had left of him. That evening, she stood at the edge of the town and looked west. The dry lakebed stretched out, a pale, scarred hide under the fading light, the cracked earth forming a million tiny canyons. Out there, under all that silence, was the ghost coach, her promise. The only person in Alkali Flats who looked at Cora without pity was Jedediah Stone. He was a man made of the same leather and dust as the land, his face a roadmap of hard seasons. He had been her father's only friend, a silent partner in belief, if not in obsession. Cora found him in his livery, mending a harness with thick, patient fingers. He looked up as her shadow fell over him, and his eyes, the color of a washed-out sky, held a flicker of recognition and sorrow. "Cora girl," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Heard you was back." He didn't say he was sorry for her loss. The words weren't needed between them. He had already paid his respects in the quiet, stoic way of the frontier. She nodded, unable to speak past the knot in her throat. She just pulled the journal from her satchel and laid it on the workbench between them. Jed looked at it, then at her. He sighed, a slow release of air that seemed to carry years of conversations with her father. He never let it go, he murmured, not as a question. He ran a thumb over the worn leather cover. You aim to finish it. Again, not a question. It was his last wish, Cora said, her voice raspy. Jed studied her face for a long moment, then gave a single, decisive nod. He pushed himself to his feet and led her to the back of the livery. In the corner stood a sturdy buckboard wagon, its wheels freshly greased. Beside it were 2 shovels, a pickaxe, a coil of thick rope, and a set of block and tackle. Leaning against the wall were weathered water barrels. In the last stall, a gray mule with long, mournful ears stood dozing in a patch of sun. His name is Dust, Jed said, gesturing to the mule. He's as stubborn as your father was, and just as strong. He'll get you out there. The wagon and tools. Samuel asked me to keep 'em for you. Paid me in advance, years ago. The foresight, the sheer certainty of it, struck Cora with a fresh wave of grief. Her father had known. He had planned for his own death to be the beginning of her work. She loaded the wagon, her movements methodical. Dust the mule watched her with intelligent, weary eyes. As she prepared to leave, Jed pressed a small, heavy canvas sack into her hand. Salt pork, beans, coffee, he said. You can't dig on an empty stomach. He hesitated, then added, Don't listen to the town, Cora. Your pa wasn't crazy. He just listened to different stories than the rest of us. She climbed onto the wagon seat, the reins feeling foreign in her hands. She looked out toward the shimmering expanse of the lakebed. It was a place of ghosts, a graveyard of water. Her father had left her a map to a tomb, and now she was going to open it. What was she really digging for? A father's approval from beyond the grave? A tangible piece of a story everyone else had dismissed? Or was she just a lost girl, burying her grief in the driest, most forgotten place on earth? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this journey into the forgotten corners of the past, be sure to subscribe for more tales of incredible discoveries. Now, let's get back to Alkali Flats, where the whispers were just beginning to find their voice. The whispers in town coalesced into a low hum of mockery. The morning Cora drove the buckboard out onto the flats. Heads turned. Men sitting on the porch of the mercantile stopped whittling to watch her go. Their silence was louder than laughter. She was a living spectacle. Samuel Hayes's final folly made flesh. As she passed the last building, a rider approached, kicking up a plume of dust. It was Silas Croft, the man who owned the largest ranch in the valley, a man whose wealth was as new as his saddle and as loud as his spurs. He reined in his fine black mare, looking down at Cora on her simple wagon, the old gray mule standing patient between the shafts. Well, I'll be, Croft said, a smirk spreading across his face. It's the little ghost digger. Heard you were back to finish your daddy's work. Cora said nothing, her hands tightening on the reins. Her father had despised Croft, a man who saw land not as a living thing, but as a page in a ledger. Tell me, girl, Croft continued, leaning on his saddle horn. When you find that big box of Spanish gold, you be sure to let me know. I might just buy this whole worthless griddle off you for a shiny $1. He laughed, a harsh, grating sound that the dry air seemed to reject. He spurred his horse and galloped away, his laughter trailing behind him. Cora watched him go, her expression unchanged. His words were like stones thrown into a deep well. They made a noise, and then were gone, but the well remained just as deep. She urged Dust forward, the wagon wheels crunching over the baked, polygonal plates of dried mud. The town vanished behind her, leaving only the immense, silent bowl of the sky and the cracked dish of the earth. Later that day, as she was setting her meager camp near the spot her father had marked, another figure appeared on the horizon. This one was on foot, moving with a slow, deliberate grace. It was Ilara, an old Paiute woman who lived on the edge of town, a person the townsfolk treated with a mixture of fear and respect. She was ancient, her face a beautiful ruin of wrinkles, her eyes holding the deep, placid knowledge of the landscape itself. She stopped a respectful distance from Cora's camp. her gaze taking in the wagon, the mule, the neatly stacked supplies. Cora offered her a dipper of water from the barrel, which the old woman accepted with a solemn nod. She drank slowly, then handed it back. Her eyes drifted from Cora to the single splinter of dark wood protruding from the earth, the only visible sign of her father's conviction. Elara stared at it for a long time, as if reading a story written there. Then she looked at Cora, her gaze direct and heavy with meaning. "The earth remembers what the water takes," she said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. It was the exact phrase from her father's journal. Cora stared at her, stunned into silence. How could she know that? Before Cora could form a question, Elara gave another small nod and turned, walking back the way she had come, melting into the heat haze. Cora was left with the echo of her words, and the unnerving feeling that she was not alone in this desolate place. The sun began to set, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. The mockery of Silas Croft felt small and distant now, replaced by the weight of Elara's cryptic warning. The land had its own secrets, and perhaps its own guardians. The first few days were a lesson in insignificance. Cora felt like a fly crawling on a dinner plate, her small camp a temporary stain on the vast, empty canvas of the lakebed. The sun was a physical weight, pressing down from a cloudless, indifferent sky. By noon, the heat rising from the cracked earth made the air shimmer, turning the distant mountains into watery apparitions. The silence was absolute, broken only by the scrape of her shovel, the huff of dust's breath, and the frantic thrum of her own heart. She established a rhythm born of necessity. Rise before the sun, when the air was cool and the color of lavender. Work until the heat became unbearable. Rest through the hottest part of the day, under a canvas tarp, stretched between the wagon and a pair of poles. Work again as the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the flats. At night, a profound cold descended. She would build a small fire of greasewood she'd hauled from the edge of the flats, its smoke rising thin and straight into a sky littered with an impossible number of stars. She would sit with Dust, the mule's quiet presence a comfort. He would stand nearby, his head low, occasionally flicking an ear at a sound only he could hear. He was a perfect companion for this place, stoic, patient, and demanding nothing but a little water and a handful of oats. She had her father's map, but a hand-drawn map is a thing of faith. She found the cluster of 3 rock formations he'd used as a landmark and paced out the distances just as he'd instructed in his notes. She drove a stake into the ground. This was the place. The only visible evidence was a shard of wood, dark and weathered, no bigger than her hand, jutting an inch out of the baked mud. It could have been anything. A piece of an old fence post, a root from a long-dead tree. It was almost nothing. Her first shovelfuls of earth were discouraging. The ground was as hard as rock. She would drive the shovel in with her boot, and it would ring with a metallic clang, purchasing only a few inches of dry, compacted soil. It was like trying to dig through pottery. After the first day, her hands were raw, her back a single, solid ache. Disappointment began to curdle in her gut. Croft's mocking laughter echoed in her mind. Digging for ghosts, girl? Maybe he was right. Maybe her father's obsession had been a sickness, and this punishing, fruitless labor was her inheritance of that madness. She slept fitfully, the hard ground unforgiving. She dreamed of water, of flash floods and roaring rivers, of her father calling her name from just beneath the surface. She would wake with a start, the silence of the lakebed rushing in to fill the void. On the third evening, sitting by her fire, a wave of despair washed over her. The task felt infinite, her tools inadequate, her body weak. She looked at the small pile of dirt she had managed to excavate. It was pathetic. She was alone, chasing a dead man's dream in the middle of nowhere. For a moment, she considered quitting. She could pack the wagon, lead Dust back to town, and leave Alkali Flats for good. But then she caught the mule's eye. He was watching her, his gaze steady and calm. It was a look of profound animal patience. He was not judging, not questioning. He was just waiting. She took a deep breath, the cold night air searing her lungs. She would not quit, not yet. She owed her father more than 3 days of doubt. She would see it through, even if she found nothing but dirt and stone. On the 5th day, the sound changed. For hours, it had been the same grating scrape of steel on sun-hardened earth. But then, with a downward thrust of the shovel, there was a dull thud, not the sharp crack of hitting a rock, but a dense, resonant sound. Wood. Cora's heart hammered against her ribs. She dropped to her knees, scrabbling at the dirt with her bare hands, her blisters forgotten. She clawed away the compacted soil, her fingers raw. Slowly, a shape began to emerge. It was not just a splinter. It was a curved, solid piece of wood, wider than her 2 hands clasped together. It was the top of a wheel, a coach wheel. It was real. A wave of dizziness swept over her. She sat back on her heels, breathing hard, staring at the impossible object buried in the earth. Her father had been right. It was here. After a moment, she leaned in closer, her scientific curiosity overriding her emotional shock. She ran a hand over its surface. The wood exposed to the air was petrified, hard and gray as stone. But where it had been encased in the dense, oxygen-starved mud, it was different. She used her knife to carefully scrape away a layer of caked dirt. Underneath, the wood was dark, almost black, and damp to the touch. The grain was still visible, a faint, swirling pattern, preserved for a century. Then she saw it, a small fleck of color, no bigger than her thumbnail, clinging to the wood. She gently brushed the dust away. It was blue, a deep, rich, cobalt blue. A memory stirred. Something her father had read to her, from an old shipping ledger he'd found in a county archive. For the Overland Express Governor's Commission, 1 coach, custom-built, painted in the territorial colors, cobalt blue and gold leaf. No one in Alkali Flats used blue paint on their wagons. It was an extravagance, a color for city carriages and government work. This wasn't just any old wreck. This was the one, the ghost coach. The anomaly settled deep in her bones, a quiet, solid confirmation. This wasn't a fool's errand. It was an archaeological dig. She looked around at the vast, empty expanse. The land didn't feel indifferent anymore. It felt watchful, like an elder guarding a secret she had just been permitted to see. The mockery of the town, the weight of her grief, it all seemed to recede, replaced by a single, sharp focus. The work was no longer an act of faith. It was an act of revelation. That night, she didn't dream of drowning. She dreamed of the deep, impossible blue, the color of a kingfisher's wing, waiting for her beneath the dust. The land was beginning to speak, and she was finally learning its language. The discovery of the wheel changed the work from a burden into a ritual. Cora no longer felt the oppressive weight of the sun or the sting of the blisters on her hands. The labor was still immense, back-breaking, and slow, but now it was purposeful. Each shovelful of earth was not just a removal of dirt, but an uncovering of truth. She worked with a meticulous patience she hadn't known she possessed. She was no longer just digging, she was excavating, treating the site with the reverence of a scholar in a forgotten library. She expanded her trench, following the curve of the buried wheel downward. Soon, her shovel struck the axle, and then the chassis. The shape of the coach began to reveal itself, a dark, sleeping leviathan emerging from its earthen tomb. Dust, the mule became the silent foreman of the operation. When she had cleared enough dirt, she would hitch him to a makeshift sledge, and he would haul the earth away from the pit, his movements slow and steady, his patience a seemingly infinite resource. He would wait at the edge of the trench, watching her, his long ears occasionally swiveling toward a distant sound. In the evenings, she would share her water with him first, rubbing the soft spot between his eyes. He was her only confidant, the sole witness to her strange and lonely task. She felt a bond with him that was deeper than words, a shared understanding of stubborn, persistent effort. As she dug deeper, the story of the coach's final moments began to unfold. It wasn't resting neatly on the old lakebed floor. It was tilted, at a sharp angle, one side buried much deeper than the other. Its front wheels snapped and twisted. Her father's journals had spoken of a flash flood, but this was more violent. This was evidence of a mudslide, a massive wall of slurry that had picked up the coach and thrown it like a child's toy, before burying it in a thick, suffocating blanket of silt. This, she realized, was the key to its preservation. The dense, airless mud had sealed the wooden structure, protecting it from the rot and decay that would have otherwise consumed it. With painstaking care, she uncovered a door panel. The cobalt blue paint was more visible here, protected from the sun, though it was cracked and peeling. A faint, swirling pattern of gold leaf was just visible beneath the grime. The territorial seal. She found a leather strap, part of the suspension, which crumbled to black dust the moment she touched it. A brass lantern, its glass shattered, lay half-buried near the front axle. Each object was a word in a sentence she was slowly piecing together. Her hands learned the story before her mind could fully articulate it. They learned the texture of century-old wood, the surprising weight of mud-filled brass, the heartbreaking fragility of preserved leather. She wasn't just digging up a stagecoach. She was digging up a moment in time, a violent, chaotic end that the earth had held in perfect, silent suspension. One evening, as the light began to fail, she finally cleared the mud away from the upper half of the passenger side door. The handle, made of tarnished brass, was still intact. The door was warped, wedged tight in its frame by the pressure of the earth. But it was there. A threshold, a way inside. A chill that had nothing to do with the evening air ran down her spine. The outside of the coach was history. The inside was a tomb. It took her another 2 days to clear enough space to pry the door open. The wood groaned in protest, the sound of a century of silence being broken. With a final, shuddering crack, the door swung inward, a few inches, releasing a puff of stale, musty air that smelled of wet earth and decay. It was the smell of a sealed room, of time itself. She peered into the darkness, her lantern held high. The interior of the coach was not empty. It was filled almost to the ceiling, with hardened mud, a perfect cast of the space within. For a moment, her heart sank. What if everything inside had rotted away, leaving nothing but dirt? But her father's mantra returned to her. The earth remembers. With a renewed sense of purpose, she began the most delicate work yet. Using a small trowel and her hands, she started to carefully chip away at the hardened mud inside the cabin. It was slow, surgical work. She removed the dirt flake by flake, brushing it away, revealing what lay beneath. The first thing to emerge was the ghostly outline of the padded leather seats, the material itself long gone, but its impression left perfectly in the mud. Then, a small, dark shape, a gentleman's satchel, the leather stiff and black. When she touched it, it flaked apart, revealing nothing but more dirt inside. She continued her work, moving toward the front of the cabin, her lantern casting dancing shadows. Her trowel hit something hard, metallic. She cleared the dirt around it. Her breath held tight in her chest. An edge of black iron appeared, then a flat surface, a rivet. She worked faster now, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The shape grew larger. It was square, solid, and immovable. It was bolted directly to the floor of the coach, tucked under the front bench. The light of her lantern slid across the pitted, rusted surface of an iron strongbox. It was exactly as the legends had described it. Solid, squat, and sealed with a lock the size of a man's fist. It was not a myth. It was not a ghost story. It was real. She reached out a trembling hand and laid it flat on the cold iron. The finality of it, the sheer, irrefutable presence of the thing, was overwhelming. Everything. The lonely journey, the town's mockery, her father's supposed madness, her own back-breaking labor. It all culminated in this single, silent object. Here, in the dark, buried heart of the coach, lay the answer. The truth her father had spent his life searching for was finally in her hands, or at least, it was within her reach. The strongbox was bolted down with a grim finality that suggested it had no intention of ever being moved. Her discovery left her with a new, more formidable problem. The strongbox was a solid block of iron, and the bolts holding it to the coach floor were thick and rusted deep into the wood. She had no tools for such a task. As she stood in the pit, contemplating her next move, she noticed a change in the air. The usual pale, cloudless sky had been replaced by a bruised, yellowish ceiling. The air grew heavy, still, and unnervously warm. The wind, which had been a constant, gentle companion, died completely. An unnatural silence fell over the lakebed. Dust, who had been dozing nearby, became agitated. He lifted his head, his nostrils flaring, his ears twitching back and forth. He let out a low, uneasy bray. Cora knew enough about this land to recognize the signs. A storm was coming. Not a summer shower, but something worse. Something violent. A look at the horizon confirmed it. A dark wall of clouds was building in the west, churning and growing with terrifying speed. A storm like this could turn the dry lakebed back into a shallow, churning sea in a matter of minutes, undoing all her work, burying the coach once more, perhaps forever. Panic seized her. She had to get the box out, now. She scrambled from the pit, grabbing a crowbar, and attacked the bolts with a desperate fury, but they wouldn't budge. As the first gust of wind hit, carrying the scent of rain and ozone, she saw a new shape on the horizon. A covered wagon, racing across the flats, trying to outrun the storm. As she watched, one of its wheels splintered, collapsing, and sending the wagon lurching to a halt. A man, a woman, and two small children spilled out. They were stranded, directly in the path of the coming deluge. Cora was faced with a choice: the Strongbox. The culmination of her life's purpose, her father's vindication, lay within her grasp. Or there were strangers, a family, in desperate need of help. The memory of her father's kindness, his quiet principle of helping a neighbor before oneself, made the choice for her. There was no real choice at all. She abandoned the coach, grabbed her rope, and urged Dust into a trot, heading straight for the stranded family. She reached them just as the first drops of rain, fat and heavy, began to fall. The man, whose name was Miller, looked at her with a mixture of terror and gratitude. His axle was shattered. "We're lost," he shouted over the rising wind. "We need to find shelter." Cora looked back at her own small, exposed camp. It was better than nothing. "Come with me," she yelled. "Hurry!" She helped them unhitch their horses and gather their children, and together they battled the wind back to her excavation site. They huddled under her canvas tarp, tied to the buckboard, as the heavens opened. The rain came down not in drops but in sheets, turning the dust to a thick, clinging slurry. The wind howled, a physical force that threatened to rip the canvas from its moorings. Through the deluge, Cora watched as the pit she had so painstakingly dug began to fill with water, the dark shape of the stagecoach slowly disappearing beneath the rising mud. She had chosen to save a family, and, in doing so, may have lost her discovery forever. The storm raged through the night, a relentless assault of wind and water. Cora and the Miller family huddled together, the canvas tarp snapping and bucking above them, the children crying softly against their mother. Mr. Miller, a blacksmith by trade, had helped her secure the wagon, his practical strength a calming presence in the chaos. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed. The sky was scrubbed clean, a pale, innocent blue. But the devil's griddle was no more. In its place was a vast, shallow lake of muddy water, stretching from one horizon to the other. Cora's heart sank. She walked to the edge of her excavation pit. It was now a small, brown pond. The top of the stagecoach was barely visible beneath the surface. All her work, submerged. But she was not alone. Mr. Miller came to stand beside her. "You saved us," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We'd have been swept away out there. My wife, my children. We owe you everything." He looked at the flooded pit. "What is that you were digging for?" Cora told him the story. Her father's belief, the town's mockery, the discovery of the coach and the strongbox. He listened intently, his expression shifting from curiosity to awe. He was a man who understood iron and wood, effort and reward. "The strongbox is still in there?" he asked. Cora nodded. Bolted down. A determined look came into his eyes. Then we'll get it out, he said. The ground is soft now. The wood will be waterlogged. It'll be easier. For the next 2 days, they worked together. Mr. Miller's blacksmithing knowledge was invaluable. Using Cora's crowbar and a hammer from his own wagon, he showed her how to work the bolts, using the waterlogged softness of the coach's floorboards to their advantage. The Miller children helped bail water from the pit with buckets. Mrs. Miller shared their food, turning their combined meager supplies into warm, nourishing meals. It was no longer a lonely task. It was a communal effort, born of shared crisis and mutual gratitude. Finally, with a great, sucking groan, the last bolt gave way. Using the block and tackle Jed had given her, they hoisted the heavy iron box from the muddy water. It sat on the edge of the pit, ancient and silent, covered in a century of grime. Getting it back to town was another challenge, but together they rigged a sledge, and with Dust, the mule, and the Miller's own horses pulling in tandem, they began the slow journey back across the muddy flats. Their arrival in Alkali Flats was a sight that stopped the town cold. The strange procession, Cora, covered head to toe in mud, the grateful Miller family, the team of animals, and the impossible iron strongbox sliding behind them, brought people out of the saloon and the mercantile. The whispers started again. But this time, they were not of mockery, but of stunned disbelief. Silas Croft was riding out of town as they were coming in. He saw the strongbox, his eyes widening. He looked at Cora, at the solid, irrefutable proof of her father's story. He opened his mouth to say something, then closed it. Without a word, he turned his horse and rode away, a silent admission of his own foolishness. The town's assayer was long dead, so they sent a rider to the county seat. 2 days later, Mr. Abernathy, a banker with soft hands and a serious expression, arrived. A crowd gathered as he examined the rusted lock. With a set of specialized tools, he worked carefully, and with a final, decisive click, the lock gave way. He lifted the heavy iron lid. The crowd pressed in, expecting to see the glint of gold coins. But there was no gold. The box was lined with oilcloth and filled with carefully wrapped parcels. Mr. Abernathy gently lifted one out. He unwrapped it to reveal a stack of brittle, yellowed documents. "My word," he breathed, his professional calm breaking. "These are the original territorial surveys, the founding deeds for the entire valley." He opened another parcel. "Mining assays from the old Spanish Peak mines. We thought these were lost forever. The strongbox didn't contain a treasure. It contained the town's entire history, its legal foundation, its claims, its very identity, all laid out in faded ink on century-old paper." Cora looked at the faces in the crowd. The doubt and ridicule were gone, replaced by a profound, humbling reverence. They weren't just looking at a girl who had found a box. They were looking at the keeper of their own story. In the quiet of the following week, the weight of what she had done settled over Cora. Lawyers and officials from the territorial capital came to Alkali Flats, their city clothes looking out of place against the dust. They examined the documents with a reverence usually reserved for holy texts. The deeds and surveys her father had sought were not just historical artifacts. They were legally binding. They clarified property lines that had been disputed for generations, validated old family claims, and, most significantly, established the town's water rights from the mountain springs, securing its future in a way no amount of gold ever could. Cora was the heir to the original claims staked by the Stagecoach's commissioner, a fact that made her, on paper, one of the most significant landowners in the territory. But the land, the titles, the sudden respect, none of it felt as real as the memory of the work itself, the feeling of the shovel in her hands, the patient presence of Dust the mule by her side. One evening, at golden hour, she walked back out to the lakebed. The water had receded, leaving the earth damp and dark. The stagecoach sat in its pit, a half-excavated skeleton, its purpose served. Mr. Abernathy had ridden out with her, a quiet respect in his demeanor. "You could sell these claims, Miss Hayes," he said gently. "You would be a very wealthy woman. You could leave this place for good." Cora looked out at the vast, silent landscape, the setting sun painting the cracks in the earth with liquid gold. She thought of her father, of his fierce, protective love for this harsh, beautiful land. She thought of the whispers and the laughter, and how they had fallen silent, replaced by the hushed tones of people rediscovering their own roots. She finally understood the meaning of the words in his journal, the words Elara had echoed. The water had taken the coach, but the earth had remembered it, held it, and given it back when someone was finally willing to listen. She turned to Mr. Abernathy, her voice quiet but clear, carrying the weight of her long journey. He wasn't digging for treasure, she said. He was digging for roots. In that single sentence, the banker understood. She wasn't the heir to a fortune. She was the steward of a history. She would not sell. She would stay. This was her home, a place whose story was now inextricably woven with her own. She had come back to bury her father's spirit, but instead, she had given it roots, planting it so deeply into the heart of Alkali Flats that it would never be forgotten. As the last sliver of sun disappeared below the horizon, she reached out and patted Dust's sturdy neck. They stood together in the gathering twilight, two stubborn, quiet souls who had listened to the land and found not what the world valued, but what was truly priceless. Thank you for joining us on this journey to the heart of the past. It's a powerful reminder that true value is often found not in what glitters, but in what endures. If you were moved by Cora's story of patience and vindication, please consider leaving a like and a comment below. And for more stories that dig deep to uncover the treasures hidden in plain sight, be sure to subscribe. We'll have another story for you soon.